don't make decisions out of desperation. So in Genesis chapter 16, we see the story of Sarai and Abram and Hagar. This is Sarah and Abraham before God changed their name. And so previous chapters, God had promised Abraham that he would be the father of many nations and that his descendants would be too numerous to count, right? So God promised that he would have children. But we see that God has taken some time. And so Sarah comes up with this bright idea, right, of really being desperate to have a family. Well, why doesn't Abraham just sleep with her slave servant, with her slave, Hagar, and maybe she could be a surrogate and she could essentially raise her family that way? Well, we learn through that story that when you make decisions out of desperation, there are unwanted consequences that you may have to deal with. And some of those include suffering, regret, blaming others, and pointing fingers to your misfortune, right? We see that it can strain relationships. It can produce unwanted results and so much more. Desperation is a sign of unbelief, of doubt. Why? Because the definition of desperation is hopelessness, resulting in some rash or decision or extreme behavior. And what is hopelessness? It's a lack of faith. We are not immune from having feelings or experiencing moments or periods of hopelessness and feeling desperate, right? But we should allow that to push us into the feet of God and to pursue God even more. God, but you said, God, this is what you had declared, so that we don't find ourselves making decisions that we are going to regret. And we can even see an example of what desperation should lead to in the story of Hannah in 1 Samuel chapter 1, when Hannah was so desperate to have a child because Peninnah was making her life, was making her miserable with all her kids and the way she was being treated, that she poured out before God, right? She let it all out to the point where Eli thought that she was drunk because of how she was praying and just weeping it out. We can also look at the example of the woman with the issue of blood, and we see that she was so desperate to get healing that she went and like, if I can just grab on Jesus's cloak, if I can just grab a hold of him, then I can be healed. And she took a big risk. Why? Because she had been bleeding. In scripture, especially in those times, a woman who was bleeding was unclean. She was ceremonially unclean. And anyone who would come in contact with her or that she would touch would become unclean as well. So, and as she's going through the crowd trying to get to Jesus, she was taking a big risk, right? Based on what their beliefs were as far as cleanliness and, the religious laws that they had. And so that's what we want when we get to that point where we're beginning to feel a little hopeless and like, Lord, I'm kind of losing my faith here because it's taking a long time and, I'm not seeing your promises come to pass. And we should be pursuing even deeper after him. Why? Because when we do that, we're reminded of who has the solution in their hands. We're reminded of who is our refuge, who has the answer, and then it will stop us from making decisions that we can potentially end up regretting. So please, let's work on not making decisions out of desperation.